Okay, so once you've got everything tracked, once you've got everything recorded, you had a basic track and you layered stuff on top of that with a bunch of overdubs. Now it's time to mix. You're done recording, and so here you are in the mixing phase. So when you're mixing, you're in your Pro Tools session, you're not recording anything new, but you're working with what you have to balance it all out and to make it sound really good. So there's a few things you want to think about when you're mixing and that kind of constitute the mixing process. First and foremost is volume balance. So that's easy to understand. Just, oh, the kick drums, needs to be turned down, or I think the snare drum could be a little louder, or the vocal needs to be louder. Just adjusting the volume so that everything is in the right balance. Part of volume balancing is something that eventually we will learn, which is called automation. You don't need to know it quite yet, but automation allows you to kind of change the volume over time. So, in this section, we want the guitar part to be really loud. Well, in the next section, there's something else that's important in the song that needs to carry the narrative of the song. We're going to be able to turn that guitar part down in the next part. So you use automation, volume automation to do that. And you can automate actually everything that's on here. So we'll talk about that eventually. But volume balance, pretty easy to understand. Getting everything to be the right volume so that the song sounds how you want it. If you want a super dancey song, you want your drums to be real loud, and if you get the idea of volume balancing. Then we go to panning, and you've learned about that. That's how far right or left things are. And I'm going to do one last video at the end of this little series about panning and some of my ideas about panning that might help you. But panning, so you're deciding, okay, let's say I have 5 instruments going and the vocal, where you want to find spots in the stereo image of how far right to left each of those elements are so they can stick out from each other, so they're not stepping on each other and getting muddy. And so each sonic element can be really clearly heard if they are panned in different ways. So another thing that helps them be really clearly heard is EQ. So you know EQ very well from your car stereo, how much high frequency, how much low frequency, how much mid frequency. And we've started to talk about frequencies a little bit. Eventually we'll get into looking at EQs. And so you're just deciding on each individual track using an EQ plugin. EQ is just short for equalization, so we're equalizing the frequencies. Each track will get its own little EQ plugin, and you can decide, well, what are the frequencies that I want to get out of this individual piece? Is it a bass guitar? Then I want to find a nice low frequency and pump that up. Is it a flute? Well, in that case, I might as well cut the low frequencies out since it's such a high frequency instrument, and then kind of accentuate those high frequencies. So frequencies are kind of like, if you're in a high frequency, you're hearing this like tss, 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 bright, crispy sounds. Low frequencies are the bass in your car, that rumbly sound. Mid frequencies can be anywhere from like honky to like warm sounds, but it'll make more sense the more you experiment with EQ. So also in the mixing phase, you work on effects. So which individual track has a reverb on it, which individual track has a delay, which individual track has distortion. So that's all stuff you can do in the mixing phase. And then finally is a concept we're not going to quite get to yet, but it's called compression. It's another thing that, just like EQ, you do to each individual track. And compression is basically a way to make each level very consistent. We'll get to that later. It's a little bit more of a complex concept, but that's your mixing phase. So you've already tracked everything. You're in your Pro Tools session. You're checking it all out, trying to make it sound good. You're in the mixing phase, and that constitutes making sure the volume of each instrument is balanced, making sure the panning scheme is all mapped out so everything has a place in the left to right spectrum, which we call the stereo image. You're EQing each individual track, deciding what brights and what low, dark lows you want in each track, and that helps them stand out from each other because you EQ, for example, let's say you have 2 acoustic guitars, you could EQ them slightly differently so they stand out from each other. You put effects on there. Let's say you've got a great vocal reverb going so that your vocal shines. And then you're also working with compression on each individual track to make sure that everything sounds consistent We'll get to compression later, but that's a quick rundown on the second stage of your production process, which is the mixing stage. So what is mastering?